Welcome, friends, to a journey unlike any other. Over the next while, we're going to visit the final resting places of 50 famous people who were once household names. Movie stars, musicians, athletes, inventors, presidents, people who packed stadiums and topped charts and lit up the silver screen, and yet today their graves sit quiet. No tour buses, no long lines of admirers, just grass and stone and sky. That's not a sad thing, it's a human thing. Fame is a tide and tides go out. But the stories behind these graves are worth hearing. So let's begin. Our first stop is a small, unassuming cemetery tucked into the streets of West Los Angeles. Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park is barely an acre in size, squeezed between high-rise buildings and a busy boulevard. Most people drive right past it without knowing it's there. But inside these walls rests one of the coolest men who ever lived, Dean Martin. Born Dino Paul Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, the son of an Italian barber, Dean Martin reinvented himself so completely that he made reinvention look easy. He started out as a nightclub singer, teamed up with Jerry Lewis for one of the most successful comedy partnerships in entertainment history, then walked away from it to become an even bigger star on his own. He was the voice behind That's Amore, Everybody Loves Somebody, and Ain't That a Kick in the Head? He was a movie star who appeared in everything from the Western Rio Bravo alongside John Wayne to the Matt Helm spy spoofs. And of course, he was the beating heart of the Rat Pack, the trio of Martin, Frank Sinatra, and Sammy Davis Jr. that practically owned Las Vegas in the early 60s. What most people don't know is that Dean Martin's easygoing, glass-in-hand persona was largely an act. Friends said he was actually shy and preferred quiet evenings at home watching westerns on television. And the drinks on his variety show were often apple juice. After the death of his son Dean Paul in a military jet crash in 1987, Martin retreated almost entirely from public life. He died on Christmas Day, 1995, at the age of 78, from respiratory failure brought on by years of heavy smoking. What made Dean Martin special wasn't just his talent, which was considerable. It was his effortlessness. Everything he did, whether it was singing a ballad, trading jabs with Frank and Sammy on stage in Vegas, or playing a cowboy opposite John Wayne, looked like the easiest thing in the world. His television variety show, The Dean Martin Show, ran for 9 seasons on NBC, and Martin was famously so relaxed about the production that he would only show up for a single rehearsal and then tape the show. The crew and guests worked around him. Somehow it worked. He was also a surprisingly effective dramatic actor. His performance in The Young Lions, opposite Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift, showed a depth that his comedy work rarely required. He rests in a crypt in the Sanctuary of Love here at Westwood, not far from Marilyn Monroe, though it's Marilyn's crypt that gets all the visitors. Dean's rests undisturbed, which he probably would have preferred. Let's leave the sunshine of California behind and head all the way across the country to Finksburg, Maryland, a tiny crossroads community northwest of Baltimore. Behind the Sandy Mount United Methodist Church, in a modest churchyard cemetery, lies someone whose face was famous the world over, even if his name sometimes escaped people: Fred Gwynne. If you watched television in the 1960s, you know Fred Gwynne. He was Herman Munster, the lovable, lumbering patriarch of the Munsters, a man who stood 6'5" and played a Frankenstein-like character with a gentleness that made millions of Americans tune in every week. Before that, he was Officer Francis Muldoon on Car 54, Where Are You? And years later, he delivered one of the most memorable supporting performances in movie comedy as Judge Chamberlain Haller in My Cousin Vinny, sparring with Joe Pesci over Southern courtroom decorum. But Gwynne was much more than an actor. He was a Harvard graduate who had served in the Navy during World War II as a radio operator on a submarine chaser. He was a painter, a sculptor, and a children's book author who wrote and illustrated titles like The King Who Reigned and A Chocolate Mousse for Dinner. By the end of his life, Gwynne had retired to a farm in Taneytown, Maryland, wanting nothing to do with Hollywood. He died of pancreatic cancer in 1993, just 8 days before his 67th birthday. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and to this day there is no headstone, no plaque, nothing but grass. Nobody quite knows why. Perhaps he simply wanted to be Fred Gwynne the man, not Fred Gwynne the actor. From the rolling farmland of Maryland, let's head to Inglewood, California, south of Los Angeles. At Inglewood Park Cemetery lies the grave of someone whose talent is almost impossible to overstate. Ella Fitzgerald, the First Lady of Song, the Queen of Jazz, and quite possibly the greatest vocal talent America has ever produced. For 6 decades, Ella Fitzgerald set the standard for jazz vocalists. Her voice had a 3-octave range, her timing was impeccable, and her scat singing was a marvel of improvisation. She recorded the legendary songbook albums, each one devoted to a single great American composer like Cole Porter, Duke Ellington, and the Gershwins. And these recordings essentially preserved the great American songbook for future generations. She won 13 Grammy Awards and sold over 40 million albums. Yet the path to greatness started with a stroke of luck. As a teenager in Harlem, Ella entered a talent contest at the Apollo Theater in 1934 planning to dance, but got so nervous she sang instead. She won, and the rest is American musical history. In her later years, Ella suffered from diabetes, which eventually led to the amputation of both legs below the knee. She gave her final concert in 1991. She died in 1996 at the age of 79 at her home in Beverly Hills. Ella's versatility was staggering. She could sing bebop with Dizzy Gillespie, swing with Count Basie, bossa nova with Antonio Carlos Jobim, and country with a Nashville backup band, and sound completely at home in every setting. Ira Gershwin said that he never knew how good his songs were until Ella Fitzgerald sang them. Her live album recorded at a concert in Berlin in 1960, Ella in Berlin, Mac the Knife, captures one of the most joyous performances in the history of recorded music. She forgets the words to Mac the Knife and improvises new ones on the spot, winning the audience over completely. Despite her enormous talent, Fitzgerald faced the same racial discrimination that plagued all black artists of her era. She was once turned away from a hotel where she was performing. Marilyn Monroe famously intervened on her behalf at a Hollywood nightclub, promising the owner that she would sit in the front row every night if he booked Ella. He did. Ella received every honor the music world could bestow: the National Medal of Arts, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, and the admiration of every singer who ever tried to phrase a lyric with elegance. Her grave at Inglewood Park Cemetery is a peaceful spot, but it doesn't see a fraction of the traffic you might expect for a woman who shaped American music as profoundly and as joyfully as anyone who ever lived. From the greatest voice in jazz to one of the most complicated men to ever hold the presidency. In Marion, Ohio, a small city about an hour north of Columbus, you'll find the Harding Memorial, the final resting place of Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States. Harding isn't exactly on most people's list of great presidents. Historians regularly rank him near the bottom. But in 1920, he won the presidency by the largest popular vote margin in American history up to that point, running on a promise of a return to normalcy after the upheaval of World War I. He was handsome, affable, and well-liked. He also presided over a spectacularly corrupt administration. The Teapot Dome scandal, in which his Interior Secretary accepted bribes in exchange for oil drilling rights on federal land, remains one of the biggest political scandals in American history. Harding died suddenly in San Francisco in 1923, at the age of 57, likely from a heart attack or stroke, though the exact cause was never fully determined because his wife refused to allow an autopsy. He and his wife Florence are interred in an impressive circular monument of white marble in Marion. And yet it receives almost no visitors today. It is one of the least visited presidential burial sites in the country, a fate that perhaps tells you something about how quickly the public moves on from even the highest office in the land. From a forgotten president to a voice that reached into nearly every American living room, let's head south to Franklin, Tennessee. At Mount Hope Cemetery lies Minnie Pearl, the queen of country comedy. For more than 50 years, Minnie Pearl was a fixture at the Grand Ole Opry. With her famous straw hat, the one that always had a price tag dangling from it, and her greeting of howdy, "I'm just so proud to be here," she was one of the most recognized entertainers in American life. Born Sarah Ophelia Colley in the small town of Centerville, Tennessee, she created the Minnie Pearl character in the late 1930s and never looked back. She appeared on the television show Hee Haw for years, was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1975, and was beloved by audiences who never realized that offstage she was a well-read, sophisticated woman who served on the boards of several Nashville institutions. In 1991, Minnie Pearl suffered a stroke that ended her performing career. She died in 1996 at the age of 83. Her grave gets occasional visits from older country music fans making a Nashville pilgrimage, but nothing like the crowds that flock to the graves of Johnny Cash or the memorials along Music Row. Let's shift from the world of entertainment to the world of ideas. In Memphis, Tennessee, at the famous Elmwood Cemetery, one of the oldest and most beautiful burial grounds in the South, rests Shelby Foote. If you watched Ken Burns's landmark documentary The Civil War in 1990, you'll remember Shelby Foote. He was the silver-haired Southern gentleman with the Mississippi drawl who narrated the battles and personalities of the war with such warmth and detail that he became the breakout star of the entire 9-episode production. Before the documentary, Foote had spent 20 years writing a 3-volume, nearly 3,000-page narrative history of the Civil War that was respected but not widely read. After Burns's series aired, all 3 volumes became bestsellers. Foote wasn't a trained historian. He was a novelist from Greenville, Mississippi, who approached history the way a storyteller would, which is precisely what made him so compelling on camera. He died in Memphis in 2005 at the age of 88. His grave at Elmwood is rarely visited, which is a shame, because few people have ever made American history feel as alive as Shelby Foote did. From someone who told the story of the Civil War to someone whose life was shaped by its aftermath, let's travel to Rochester, New York. In Mount Hope Cemetery, one of the oldest municipal cemeteries in America, lies the grave of Susan B. Anthony. Anthony spent more than 50 years fighting for women's suffrage and was arrested in 1872 for the crime of voting. She didn't live to see the 19th Amendment pass. That happened in 1920, 14 years after her death, but it's often called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in her honor. Before suffrage consumed her life, Anthony was also a passionate abolitionist and temperance advocate. She died in 1906 at the age of 86 in her home in Rochester, and her funeral drew enormous crowds. Today, her grave occasionally sees visitors, particularly around Election Day, when a tradition developed of leaving "I voted" stickers on her headstone. But between elections, this grave sits quiet, in a city that most tourists never visit, honoring a woman whose work changed the fundamental nature of American democracy. From a pioneer of women's rights to pioneers of flight, let's head southwest to Dayton, Ohio and Woodland Cemetery. Here lies Orville Wright, one half of the duo that achieved powered flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in December 1903 and changed the course of human history. Orville was the younger of the 2 brothers and the one who actually piloted the first flight, a 12-second journey covering just 120 feet. His brother Wilbur died of typhoid fever in 1912 at just 45, but Orville lived until 1948, long enough to see the airplane transform from a rickety wooden contraption into a weapon of war and a vehicle of mass transportation. He witnessed both world wars, the dawn of the jet age, and even the first flights that would lead to the space program. He lived quietly in Dayton, tinkering in his laboratory and serving on various scientific boards. Orville died of a heart attack at the age of 76. He's buried alongside Wilbur, their father, and their sister, Catherine, in the family plot at Woodland. For 2 men who literally launched the age of aviation, their graves see remarkably few visitors. Now let's head back to California. In Culver City, at Holy Cross Cemetery, a large Catholic cemetery with flat grave markers and rolling lawns, rests Bela Lugosi. If you've ever seen anyone do a Dracula impression, The slicked-back hair, the cape, the thick accent, they're doing Bela Lugosi, whether they know it or not. The Hungarian-born actor starred in Universal's 1931 Dracula and essentially created the modern image of the vampire. He was elegant, menacing, and mesmerizing on screen. Unfortunately, he was typecast for the rest of his career, spending decades in increasingly low-budget horror films. By the 1950s, he was nearly broke and battling an addiction to painkillers. He ended up working with the notorious director Ed Wood on films like Bride of the Monster. There's an irony to his burial that's hard to miss. The man who played Count Dracula, a character repelled by crosses and holy symbols, rests for eternity in a place called Holy Cross. He was buried wearing one of his Dracula capes at the suggestion of his family. His funeral in 1956 was attended by about 60 people, including Ed Wood and the actors Vincent Price and Peter Lorre. Lugosi had died of a heart attack at the age of 73, alone in his apartment. Frank Sinatra reportedly helped pay for his burial costs, though the two may never have met in person. Let's stay right here at Holy Cross, because just across the grounds rests another giant of the Golden Age, Bing Crosby. In the 1930s and 40s, Bing Crosby was arguably the most popular entertainer in the world. He was the best-selling recording artist of his era, the star of the road pictures with Bob Hope, and the voice behind White Christmas, which remains one of the best-selling singles in history. He won an Academy Award for Best Actor for Going My Way in 1944, and received nominations for The Bells of St. Mary's and The Country Girl as well. His easygoing baritone and relaxed style influenced an entire generation of singers, from Frank Sinatra to Perry Como. Off-screen, Crosby was a complicated figure. His eldest sons later described a strict and sometimes harsh upbringing. But to the American public, he was the embodiment of warmth. Crosby died in 1977 at the age of 74, collapsing on a golf course in Spain after finishing a round. It was a death that somehow seemed to suit a man who always appeared at ease. To understand how big Bing Crosby was, consider this. During World War II, the U.S. military determined that his voice was the most effective morale booster they had. His recordings were played constantly on armed forces radio, and he performed hundreds of shows for troops. General Eisenhower later said that Crosby had done more for military morale than anyone else. After the war, Crosby remained a dominant force. He was also an early investor in television and one of the first performers to pre-record his shows on tape rather than broadcast live, an innovation that changed the industry. Crosby was also the star of the Road to Film series with Bob Hope, a string of enormously popular comedies that showcased his effortless chemistry with Hope. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Going My Way in 1944, playing Father O'Malley, and was nominated the following year for reprising the role in The Bells of St. Mary, S. And his version of White Christmas, recorded in just 18 minutes in 1942, became the best-selling single of all time, a record it held for decades. His grave at Holy Cross doesn't draw much attention these days. For the man who was once the biggest star in every medium, radio, records, film, and television, his resting place is surprisingly quiet. From Bing Crosby's casual cool, let's travel 3,000 miles to Valhalla, New York, a leafy suburb north of Manhattan. At Kensico Cemetery, surrounded by rolling green hills, rests Danny Kaye, the beloved comedian, actor, and humanitarian who was one of the biggest stars in the world in the 1940s and 50s. Danny Kaye could do it all. He could sing, dance, perform tongue-twisting comedy routines at breakneck speed, and move an audience to tears, sometimes in the same scene. His films like The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, Hans Christian Andersen, and The Court Jester are classics of American comedy. The Court Jester alone gave us the famous tongue twister about the pellet with the poison being in the vessel with the pestle, while the chalice from the palace has the brew that is true. Kaye was also a tireless humanitarian who served as the first Goodwill ambassador for UNICEF, traveling the world to advocate for children. For this work, he received the French Legion of Honor and a special Academy Award. Off-screen, he was an accomplished cook, a licensed pilot, and he guest-conducted major symphony orchestras around the world, mostly for charity. He died of heart failure in 1987, at the age of 74. His grave at Kensico sits amid handsome grounds that also hold other notable names, but very few people specifically seek out Danny Kaye anymore. From comedy to combat, let's head south to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. At Forest Lawn Memorial Gardens, a different forest lawn from the famous one in California, lies Rocky Marciano, the only heavyweight boxing champion in history to retire with a perfect record. 49 wins, 0 losses, with 43 knockouts. He held the heavyweight title from 1952 to 1956 and beat some of the greatest fighters of his era, including Joe Louis, Jersey Joe Walcott, and Ezzard Charles. Marciano was small for a heavyweight, standing just 5 feet 10 and weighing around 185 pounds, but he hit with devastating power and had an iron chin that seemed impervious to punishment. After retiring undefeated, he stayed out of the ring and lived comfortably on appearance fees and business ventures. Tragically, he died in a small plane crash in Iowa on August 31, 1969, the day before his 46th birthday. He was heading to a birthday party. The pilot attempted a landing in poor weather, and the plane struck a tree. Marciano's perfect record still stands, and no heavyweight champion since has matched it. Yet his grave in Florida sees almost no visitors, a quiet marker for a man who was once the toughest person on the planet. Let's leave the boxing ring behind and enter the world of literature. In Ketchum, Idaho, tucked into the mountains of the Sun Valley area, the Ketchum Cemetery is where Ernest Hemingway rests. Hemingway is one of those names that transcends literature. Even people who've never read a word he wrote know the name, the image, the myth. He wrote, "The sun also rises, a farewell to arms, for whom the bell tolls, and the old man and the sea," which won him the Pulitzer Prize in 1953. The following year, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was a war correspondent, a deep-sea fisherman, a bullfighting aficionado, and a larger-than-life personality who lived hard and wrote lean, spare prose that changed American fiction forever. But behind the tough guy exterior was a man plagued by depression, alcoholism, and the physical toll of numerous injuries and illnesses accumulated over a lifetime of adventure. In the summer of 1961, at his home in Ketchum, Hemingway took his own life. He was 61 years old. What most people don't know about Hemingway is how profoundly his war experiences shaped him. He was seriously wounded in World War I at the age of 18 while serving as an ambulance driver in Italy, and that experience formed the core of A Farewell to Arms. He covered the Spanish Civil War, D-Day, and the liberation of Paris as a journalist, always getting as close to the fighting as possible. The physical toll was immense. He survived 2 plane crashes in Africa on consecutive days, a car accident, and various tropical diseases. By his final years in Idaho, the man who had once been the most vigorous writer in America was ravaged by depression and the cumulative damage of a life lived at full volume. His grave is simple, a flat stone marker that is sometimes obscured by fallen brush and leaves. Visitors occasionally leave small tokens, but the cemetery is small and remote. It's a fittingly rugged final resting place for a man who prized simplicity in both his writing and his life. From the spare prose of Hemingway to the soaring voice of the concert hall, let's head to Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania, a suburb on the main line outside Philadelphia. At Westminster Cemetery rests Marian Anderson, the contralto whose voice was so extraordinary that the conductor Arturo Toscanini once told her a voice like hers comes along once in 100 years. Anderson broke racial barriers throughout her career. In 1939, when the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to let her perform at Constitution Hall in Washington because she was black, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt helped arrange a free open-air concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. 75,000 people attended, and millions more listened on radio. It became one of the defining moments of the early civil rights era. In 1955, Anderson became the first African-American soloist to perform at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. She later served as a delegate to the United Nations and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Anderson died in 1993 at the age of 96, and her grave in the Philadelphia suburbs is a quiet, understated resting place for a woman whose voice and courage helped change the country. Let's swing across the country to the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. At San Fernando Mission Cemetery, one of the most historic cemeteries in California, established alongside the old Spanish mission, lies Bob Hope. For the better part of the 20th century, Bob Hope was America's comedian. He hosted the Academy Awards a record 19 times. He entertained American troops overseas for decades, from World War II through the Persian Gulf War, performing in war zones that would have made most entertainers refuse the invitation. His television specials were ratings juggernauts. His road pictures with Bing Crosby, whom we visited earlier at Holy Cross, were box office gold. Hope was also a gifted golfer, a shrewd businessman, and a man who accumulated a real estate fortune that made him one of the wealthiest entertainers in history. He lived to be 100 years old, dying in 2003, just 2 months after his 100th birthday, from pneumonia. Hope's USO tours became the stuff of legend. He traveled to war zones during World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Persian Gulf War, always bringing along a troupe of entertainers and always landing his jokes with perfect timing. The troops worshipped him. He was awarded an honorary knighthood by Queen Elizabeth II, received the Congressional Gold Medal, and his name became synonymous with patriotic entertainment. He was also one of the shrewdest real estate investors in Southern California history, accumulating thousands of acres of prime land that made him one of the wealthiest entertainers of his generation. Despite all of this, his grave at San Fernando Mission doesn't draw the kind of foot traffic you might expect for a man who spent 70 years making America laugh. From the king of comedy, let's travel to a very different kind of storyteller. In Providence, Rhode Island, at Swan Point Cemetery, overlooking the Seekonk River, rests H.P. Lovecraft, the author who almost single-handedly created modern cosmic horror. Lovecraft wrote stories like The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, and The Shadow over Innsmouth, tales of ancient, incomprehensible beings that dwarfed humanity into insignificance. During his lifetime, he was essentially unknown outside a small circle of pulp magazine readers. He published mostly in weird tales and never saw a book of his work published while he was alive. He died in 1937 at the age of 46 from intestinal cancer, nearly penniless, and was buried in his family's plot at Swan Point. It took decades for his reputation to grow. Today, Lovecraft is considered one of the most influential horror writers of the 20th century. His creations, Cthulhu, Arkham, the Necronomicon, have permeated everything from Stephen King novels to Hollywood blockbusters to video games. His original grave was in a family plot with only the Phillips family name marked. It wasn't until 1977 that fans raised money for a headstone bearing his own name. The grave gets occasional visits from horror enthusiasts, but it's a far cry from the pilgrimage site you'd expect for a man who invented an entire mythology. From horror fiction to the invention that lights the room you're sitting in right now, let's head to West Orange, New Jersey. At his estate called Glenmont, now part of the Thomas Edison National Historical Park, lies Thomas Edison. Edison is arguably the most prolific inventor in American history. He held over 1,000 patents and gave the world the phonograph, the practical incandescent light bulb, and the motion picture camera. He built the first industrial research laboratory. He was, in many ways, the man who invented the modern world. Edison was also famously difficult, stubborn, and competitive. He slept only a few hours a night and expected his employees to match his pace. His rivalry with Nikola Tesla over alternating versus direct current is one of the great feuds in scientific history. Edison died in 1931 at the age of 84, and his estate in West Orange is now a national park. But the truth is, very few people make the trip. The park exists, the grave is there, but the crowds are not. Edison's legacy lives in every light switch and movie screen. But his resting place goes mostly unnoticed, a fate the tireless self-promoter would probably find baffling. From the father of the light bulb, let's drive south to Baltimore. At Westminster Hall and Burying Ground, in the shadow of the University of Maryland campus, lies Edgar Allan Poe. Poe gave the world The Raven, The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher, and is widely credited as the inventor of the detective story through his tales of C. Auguste Dupin. He lived a life marked by poverty, loss, and struggle, and he died in Baltimore in 1849 at the age of 40 under circumstances that remain genuinely mysterious. He was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore, wearing clothes that weren't his own, and died 4 days later. The attending physician listed the cause of death as congestion of the brain, but theories over the years have ranged from alcohol poisoning to rabies to foul play. For decades, a mysterious figure known as the Poe Toaster visited his grave every January 19th, Poe's birthday, leaving 3 roses and a bottle of cognac. That tradition stopped in 2009 and has been sporadically revived since. Poe's original burial site in the back of the churchyard was nearly forgotten before he was reinterred in a more prominent location near the entrance with a proper monument in 1875. Poe's influence on literature and popular culture is almost incalculable. He didn't just write horror stories, he invented the detective story with The Murders in the Rue Morgue, pioneered science fiction, and laid the groundwork for the psychological thriller. Arthur Conan Doyle, Alfred Hitchcock, and Stephen King all acknowledge deep debts to his work. And yet, during his lifetime, Poe was mostly poor, mostly miserable, and mostly unappreciated. He earned just $9 for The Raven, the poem that made him famous. His death at 40 remains one of the great unsolved mysteries in literary history. The grave gets a flurry of attention around Halloween, but for most of the year, the burying ground sits in the shadow of downtown Baltimore, quiet and overlooked, which Poe himself would probably have found poetically appropriate. Let's brighten the mood and head to suburban Chicago. At Forest Park, Illinois, in a cemetery called Woodlawn, rests someone who became one of the biggest radio stars in America by performing ventriloquism on the radio. Yes, you heard that right. Edgar Bergen was a ventriloquist whose act people listened to rather than watched, and somehow it worked beautifully. Bergen and his wooden dummy Charlie McCarthy were a sensation in the 1930s and 40s. Charlie had his own personality, wisecracking, girl-chasing, and cheerfully disrespectful to Bergen's celebrity guests. Bergen won a special Academy Award for creating Charlie McCarthy, and that Oscar was appropriately made of wood. Bergen was also the father of actress Candice Bergen, who became a star in her own right on Murphy Brown. Edgar Bergen died in 1978 at the age of 75, just days after performing what he announced would be his final show. He passed in his sleep, and there's something poetic about a man who spent his career giving voice to a piece of wood going so peacefully. His grave in suburban Chicago is almost never visited. From a master of voices to a man of a single unmistakable voice, let's jump coast to Palm Springs, California. At Desert Memorial Park rests Sonny Bono. Before he was a congressman and before he was the mayor of Palm Springs, Sonny Bono was one half of Sonny and Cher, the pop duo that dominated the 1960s with the hit I Got You Babe and then conquered 1970s television with the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour. Sonny was the shorter, mustachioed, self-deprecating half who cheerfully played the fool to Cher's glamour. Behind the scenes, he was a sharp music producer who had worked with Phil Spector in the early 60s before striking out on his own. After his entertainment career faded, Bono reinvented himself in politics, first as mayor of Palm Springs and then as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He died in 1998 at the age of 62 in a skiing accident at Heavenly Ski Resort near Lake Tahoe. Cher delivered a tearful eulogy at his funeral. Today, his grave at Desert Memorial Park is seldom visited, a quiet end for a man who was once half of one of the most famous couples in America. From the desert to the suburbs of New York, let's visit one of the greatest athletes in American history. At Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York, about 30 minutes north of Manhattan, rests Babe Ruth, the Sultan of Swat, the Bambino. Babe Ruth transformed baseball from a pitcher's game into a slugger's spectacle and became the most famous athlete in America. He hit 714 home runs, a record that stood for nearly 4 decades until Hank Aaron broke it in 1974. Before Ruth arrived in New York, baseball was a game of bunts, stolen bases, and manufactured runs. Ruth changed all of that by swinging for the fences. And the fans loved it. Attendance soared wherever he played. He saved baseball after the Black Sox scandal of 1919 threatened to destroy the sport's credibility, and he was the reason the Yankees needed a bigger ballpark, which is why the original Yankee Stadium was nicknamed the house that Ruth built. He led the New York Yankees to 4 World Series titles and was among the first 5 players inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. But what makes Ruth remarkable is not just the statistics. It's the mythology. He was larger than life in every sense, a man of enormous appetites and enormous heart who played with an infectious, childlike joy that made the whole country fall in love with the game. Born in Baltimore and raised partly in a reformatory school, he went from impoverished beginnings to becoming the highest-paid athlete of his era. His personality was as big as his swing. He loved kids, and children adored him. The famous story of him promising a home run to a sick boy in the hospital, while impossible to fully verify, fits the man perfectly. Ruth's appetite for everything, food, drink, women, life, was legendary. He reportedly ate 12 hot dogs between games of a doubleheader. He spent money as fast as he earned it. When someone pointed out that he made more money than President Hoover, Ruth reportedly replied, "I had a better year than he did." Ruth died of nasopharyngeal cancer in 1948 at the age of 53. His body lay in state at Yankee Stadium, and more than 75,000 people filed past his coffin over 2 days. Today, his grave at Gate of Heaven is occasionally visited by baseball pilgrims, but not nearly as often as you'd think for the man many still consider the greatest player the game has ever seen. From the ballpark to the neighborhood, let's drive to Latrobe, Pennsylvania. At Unity Cemetery lies Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, the man in the cardigan who told every child in America that he liked them just the way they were. Fred Rogers was a Presbyterian minister and educator who created Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which aired on public television from 1968 to 2001. For over 30 years, he spoke directly to children through the television screen with a gentleness, sincerity, and respect that was unlike anything else on television, before or since. He was inducted into the Television Hall of Fame and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. When he died of stomach cancer in 2003 at the age of 74, the outpouring of grief was immense. His grave is in the town where he grew up and where he chose to be buried. It's a modest marker, befitting a man who lived modestly, and while it is known to residents of Latrobe, it doesn't draw large crowds from beyond the community. Let's go west again to Glendale, California, and the famous Forest Lawn Memorial Park, the sprawling cemetery in the Verdugo Hills that holds more Hollywood royalty than perhaps any other place on Earth. Forest Lawn famously doesn't help visitors locate celebrity graves, but those who know where to look can find Errol Flynn. In the 1930s and 40s, Flynn was the definitive swashbuckler, the star of Captain Blood, the adventures of Robin Hood, the Seahawk, and Dodge City. He was impossibly handsome, athletic, and charismatic, and his Robin Hood remains one of the most iconic performances in cinema history. Flynn lived just as recklessly off-screen as his characters lived on it. His lifestyle of heavy drinking, romantic exploits, and legal troubles made him as notorious for his personal life as he was famous for his films. The phrase "in like Flynn" entered the American language as a tribute to his reputation. By his late 40s, his health had deteriorated rapidly. He died of a heart attack in 1959 at the age of 50, and his doctor said he had the body of a much older man. Flynn's resting place at Forest Lawn sits quietly among the hills, largely forgotten by a public that has moved on to newer heroes. from a swashbuckler to a man of 1,000 voices. At Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, in the Beth Olam section, rests Mel Blanc. If you've ever laughed at Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, Tweety Bird, Yosemite Sam, Foghorn Leghorn, Barney Rubble, or the Roadrunner, you've heard Mel Blanc. He performed over 1,000 cartoon characters during a career that spanned radio, film, and television from the 1930s to the late 1980s. Warner Brothers called him the man of 1,000 voices, and for once, the marketing wasn't an exaggeration. What most people don't know is that Blanc was in a near-fatal car accident in 1961 that left him in a coma for weeks. According to a well-known account, his doctors tried everything to rouse him, and one of them finally addressed him as Bugs Bunny, asking, "What's up, Doc?" Blanc reportedly responded in character. Whether that story is precisely true or slightly embellished, it speaks to how deeply those characters lived inside the man. Blanc died in 1989 at the age of 81 from heart disease and emphysema. Hollywood Forever Cemetery draws visitors for its movie screenings and its famous residents like Rudolph Valentino and Judy Garland, but the range of Blanc's work is staggering when you stop to think about it. He voiced characters in over 1,000 cartoons. He was Bugs Bunny's wisecracking New York confidence and Daffy Duck's sputtering indignation. He was Porky Pig's gentle stammer, Tweety Bird's innocent lisp, and Yosemite Sam's explosive temper. He was Barney Rubble on the Flintstones. He was the voice of Woody Woodpecker in several cartoons and did voice work for hundreds of radio programs. In 1961, Blanc was in a near-fatal car accident that left him in a coma. According to his family, he was unresponsive to doctors until one asked, "How are you feeling today, Bugs Bunny?" And Blanc reportedly answered, "In character, just fine, Doc." Whether the story is perfectly true or slightly embellished, it captures something essential about a man whose characters were so deeply part of him that they could reach him even when nothing else could. His headstone reads, "That's all, folks." The perfect farewell for a man who gave voice to an entire universe. Blanc's resting place in the Beth Olam section of Hollywood Forever doesn't draw the foot traffic his enormous legacy deserves. From the world of cartoons to the world of jazz. Let's head across the country to the Bronx, New York, and Woodlawn Cemetery, one of the grandest burial grounds in America. Here rests Duke Ellington, the band leader and composer who took jazz from the nightclubs to the concert halls and made it America's classical music. Edward Kennedy Ellington, known to the world as Duke, led his orchestra for more than 50 years, composing hundreds of pieces, including Take the A-Train, Mood Indigo, It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing, and Sophisticated Lady. He composed everything from 3-minute radio hits to full-length suites and sacred concerts. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1969, and after his death, the Pulitzer Board gave him a special posthumous citation recognizing his contributions to music and culture. Ellington kept performing almost until the very end. He died of lung cancer and pneumonia in 1974 at the age of 75, and over 12,000 mourners attended his funeral at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in Manhattan. What separated Ellington from every other bandleader was his ability to compose specifically for the individual musicians in his orchestra. He didn't write for instruments, he wrote for the people who played them, tailoring his compositions to the unique sounds of each player. The result was music of astonishing richness and specificity. His orchestra wasn't just a band, it was an instrument in itself, and Ellington played it like no one else could. Beyond jazz, Ellington composed film scores, ballet music, and a series of sacred concerts that he performed in cathedrals around the world and considered his most important work. When he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, he told President Nixon that there were 4 freedoms, and the most important of them was freedom from hate. His grave at Woodlawn is in a cemetery that holds many jazz legends, but foot traffic has dwindled considerably over the decades. For a man who kept an orchestra together for half a century and composed over 1,000 pieces of music, the silence around his grave is striking. While we're here at Woodlawn, let's take a short walk to visit another titan. Miles Davis is buried here as well, the trumpet player who reinvented jazz so many times it was hard for even devoted fans to keep up. From bebop to cool jazz to hard bop to jazz fusion, Davis was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. His album Kind of Blue is the best-selling jazz album of all time and is considered by many critics the single greatest jazz recording ever made. He also recorded Bitches Brew, which fused jazz with rock and opened an entirely new sonic territory. Davis won 9 Grammy Awards over his career and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He was also famously difficult and uncompromising, with a raspy speaking voice that came from surgery on a vocal cord polyp. Davis died of a stroke, pneumonia, and respiratory failure in 1991 at the age of 65. He's said to have been buried with 1 or more of his trumpets, fitting for a man who communicated more through his horn than through words. Davis's influence extended far beyond music. His personal style, the sharp suits, the sports cars, the sunglasses, the cool detachment, made him a cultural icon. He was also uncompromising about racial dignity, famously confronting a police officer who tried to move him along outside Birdland, the New York jazz club where he was performing. The officer beat him and arrested him, and the photograph of Davis, his white suit bloodied, on the front page of newspapers, became a symbol of the casual brutality Black Americans faced, even at the height of their artistic achievement. His autobiography, written with Quincy Troupe, is one of the most candid and unsparing memoirs in music history. His grave at Woodlawn, like Duke Ellington's nearby, is a quiet spot in a vast cemetery that most New Yorkers have never set foot in. Let's leave the Bronx and travel south across the East River to Brooklyn. At Greenwood Cemetery, set on rolling hills with sweeping views of the Manhattan skyline and the Statue of Liberty, rests Leonard Bernstein. The conductor and composer of West Side Story, On the Town, and Candide, Bernstein was one of the towering figures of 20th century American music. He was the first American-born conductor to lead a major American symphony orchestra, the New York Philharmonic, and served as its music director for over a decade. His Young People's Concerts, televised on CBS from 1958 to 1972, introduced an entire generation of Americans to classical music in a way nobody had managed before. West Side Story, his 1957 collaboration with Stephen Sondheim, remains one of the most acclaimed musicals in Broadway history. Bernstein was a passionate educator, a political activist, and a man of enormous personal charisma who seemed to vibrate with energy. He died of a heart attack in 1990 at the age of 72, just 5 days after announcing his retirement from conducting. Bernstein was also a man of contradictions. He was a populist who conducted the most elite orchestras in the world. He was a political progressive who attracted FBI scrutiny for his associations with left-wing causes. He was a husband and father who struggled privately with his sexuality in an era that demanded secrecy. Through it all, the music poured out of him with an urgency that was almost physical. If you've ever seen footage of Bernstein conducting, you know what that urgency looked like. Leaping, sweating, singing along, conducting with his entire body as though the music might kill him if he held anything back. He composed the score for On the Waterfront, which won the Academy Award, and his Chichester Psalms and Symphony No. 2 are fixtures of the concert repertoire. While Greenwood Cemetery has become more popular with visitors in recent years, drawn by its architecture and scenic views, Bernstein's specific grave remains a quiet corner of it. Medal of Freedom. Jordan retired from Congress in 1979 due to multiple sclerosis, taught at the University of Texas, and died in 1996 at the age of 59 from pneumonia, complicated by leukemia. Jordan's voice was so distinctive and so commanding that simply hearing her speak was an event. She spoke in measured, rolling cadences that carried the weight of constitutional law and moral authority simultaneously. When she addressed the 1976 Democratic National Convention, she became the first African-American woman to deliver a keynote address at a major party convention, and she did it with a speech that brought delegates to their feet. She was a woman of immense privacy who revealed almost nothing about her personal life and expected the same discretion from others. Her legacy lives on at the University of Texas, where the Barbara Jordan statue stands on campus and the LBJ School of Public Affairs carries her influence in its curriculum. Her grave in Austin receives far fewer visitors than you'd expect for someone who was once called the most influential woman in Texas. From a voice of conscience to a voice of heartbreak, let's head to Montgomery, Alabama. At Oakwood Annex Cemetery lies Hank Williams, country music's most tragic and gifted songwriter. In a career that lasted barely 6 years, Hank Williams wrote some of the greatest songs in American music. Your Cheatin' Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, Hey Good Lookin', Cold Cold Heart, and Jambalaya. He was a skinny kid from rural Alabama who sang with such raw emotion that he could make a barroom full of truck drivers weep. He was the biggest star in country music by the time he was 25, but Williams was also battling alcoholism and chronic back pain, and his personal life was a mess of broken marriages and missed performances. The Grand Ole Opry fired him in 1952 for unreliability. On New Year's Day 1953, en route to a concert in Canton, Ohio, Hank Williams died in the back seat of his Cadillac. He was 29 years old. The cause of death was heart failure, likely aggravated by his addictions. What made Williams transcendent wasn't just his songwriting, which was extraordinary. It was his delivery. He sang like a man who had lived every word, because he had. Your Cheatin' Heart was written in the back of a car during a long drive. I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry is often cited as the greatest country song ever recorded, a title it's held for 7 decades. After his death, his songs were covered by everyone from Ray Charles to Hank Williams Jr., to many of the rock and roll artists who followed. Bob Dylan called him the greatest songwriter of all time. His funeral in Montgomery drew an estimated 20,000 people, more than any event in the city since the inauguration of Jefferson Davis. His grave does get some visitors, country music faithful who make the pilgrimage, but the numbers are nothing like what you'd expect for the most important figure in the history of country music. From the honky-tonks to the quiet study, let's travel to Amherst, Massachusetts. At West Cemetery rests Emily Dickinson, one of the most important poets in the English language. Dickinson wrote nearly 1,800 poems during her lifetime, yet fewer than a dozen were published while she was alive. She spent most of her adult life in seclusion at her family's home in Amherst, rarely venturing out, communicating with the outside world primarily through letters. After her death in 1886 at the age of 55 from what was likely kidney disease, her sister Lavinia discovered the enormous trove of poems, handwritten and bound into small booklets, and began the long process of getting them published. What emerged was one of the most original bodies of work in all of literature. Short, intense, fiercely compressed poems about death, immortality, nature, and the inner life. Dickinson's reclusion has fascinated generations of readers and scholars. She dressed almost exclusively in white in her later years and communicated with visitors from behind a partially closed door. But her inner life, as revealed in her poems, was anything but quiet. She wrote about death with unflinching directness, about love with startling passion, and about the natural world with a precision that still astonishes scientists and poets alike. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me is one of the most famous opening lines in all of poetry, and it captures Dickinson's genius in a single stroke, taking the most terrifying subject in human experience and rendering it with eerie, almost playful calm. She was buried here in the family plot at West Cemetery. Her grave is simple, and while literary scholars and poetry lovers do occasionally make the trip, Amherst is a small college town well off the beaten path. From the world of poetry to the world of politics, let's travel to Austin, Texas. At the Texas State Cemetery, a beautifully maintained burial ground reserved for the state's most distinguished citizens, lies Barbara Jordan. If you were watching television during the summer of 1974, you will remember Barbara Jordan. She was the freshman congresswoman from Houston who delivered one of the most powerful speeches of the Watergate hearings, beginning with the declaration that her faith in the Constitution was whole, complete, and total. Her voice, deep, resonant, and utterly commanding, silenced the room. Jordan was the first African American elected to the Texas Senate after Reconstruction, the first black woman elected to Congress from the Deep South, and a figure who broke barriers with the sheer force of her intellect and oratory. She gave the keynote address at the 1976 Democratic National Convention, a distinction she earned again in 1992, and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Jordan retired from Congress in 1979 due to multiple sclerosis, taught ethics at the University of Texas, and died in 1996 at the age of 59 from pneumonia, complicated by leukemia. Jordan's voice was so distinctive and so commanding that simply hearing her speak was an event. She spoke in measured, rolling cadences that carried the weight of constitutional law and moral authority simultaneously. When she addressed the 1976 Democratic National Convention, she became the first African-American woman to deliver a keynote address at a major party convention, and she did it with a speech that brought delegates to their feet. She was a woman of immense privacy who revealed almost nothing about her personal life and expected the same discretion from others. Her legacy lives on at the University of Texas, where the Barbara Jordan statue stands on campus, and the LBJ School of Public Affairs carries her influence in its curriculum. Her grave in Austin receives far fewer visitors than you'd expect for someone who was once called the most influential woman in Texas. Let's step out of the library and into the comedy club. At Hillside Memorial Park in Culver City, California, rests Jack Benny, one of the most beloved comedians in American history. For nearly 40 years, Jack Benny was a fixture of American entertainment, first on radio, then on television. His character was a vain, stingy, perpetually 39-year-old violinist, and the humor came from Benny's extraordinary sense of timing. He could get a bigger laugh from a long pause than most comedians could get from their best punchline. His radio show ran from 1932 to 1955, and his television show from 1950 to 1965. He was consistently one of the highest-rated performers on both media. The famous gag where a robber says "your money or your life," and Benny pauses so long the audience roars with laughter before he finally says, "I'm thinking it over," is considered one of the greatest comedy moments in broadcast history. Offstage, Benny was known as one of the kindest, most generous people in show business, a sharp contrast to his on-screen miser. He died of pancreatic cancer in 1974 at the age of 80. His resting place at Hillside draws only a handful of visitors these days. What set Benny apart from every other comedian of his era was his willingness to be the butt of the joke. While other comedians played smart and made those around them look foolish, Benny played vain and cheap and clueless, and let his supporting cast, Rochester, Mary Livingston, Dennis Day, and Phil Harris, get the biggest laughs at his expense. It was a revolutionary approach to comedy, and it influenced every sitcom that followed where the lead character is the least competent person in the room. Johnny Carson idolized Benny and considered him the greatest comedian who ever lived. George Burns, his lifelong best friend, delivered one of the most moving eulogies in Hollywood history at his funeral. A generation that grew up on Jack Benny is growing smaller every year, and younger audiences, sadly, mostly don't know the name of a man who made an entire nation laugh for 4 decades. It's a loss. The world could always use more people willing to be the butt of their own joke. From laughter to glamour, let's stay right here at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City for one more visit. Also buried in these grounds is Rita Hayworth, the woman once called the love goddess of Hollywood. Born Margarita Carmen Cancino, the daughter of a Spanish dancer, she was performing professionally by her teens. By the 1940s, she was one of the biggest movie stars in the world and the top pinup girl for American soldiers during World War II. Her image was reportedly attached to the atomic bomb tested at Bikini Atoll, a fact that disturbed her greatly. On screen, she was magnetic in films like Gilda, where her performance of Put the Blame on Mame became one of the most iconic moments in movie history, and CoverGirl, opposite Gene Kelly. Her personal life was turbulent. She married 5 times, including to Orson Welles, with whom she made The Lady from Shanghai, and to Prince Ali Khan. She once said, "They go to bed with Gilda and wake up with me." In her later years, Hayworth suffered from Alzheimer's disease, though it wasn't properly diagnosed for some time. Her daughter Yasmin Aga Khan became an advocate for Alzheimer's research. Hayworth died in 1987 at the age of 68. Her grave at Holy Cross is here among many Hollywood luminaries, including Bing Crosby and Bela Lugosi, whom we visited earlier. Hayworth's story is, in many ways, the story of old Hollywood's cruelty. She was transformed by the studio system from a dark-haired Spanish surname dancer into a red-haired all-American glamour queen through painful electrolysis treatments that raised her hairline and a name change that erased her heritage. She became the image men projected their fantasies onto and spent her life trying to be seen as a real person beneath the image. Her battle with Alzheimer's, which was little understood at the time, was initially mistaken for alcoholism, and she suffered years of misdiagnosis and public humiliation before the true cause of her decline became clear. Her daughter's advocacy helped raise awareness of the disease at a crucial time, but very few people come looking for the love goddess these days. Let's leave the movie stars behind and head to Louisville, Kentucky. At Cave Hill Cemetery, one of the most beautiful cemeteries in the South, with rolling hills, lakes, and mature trees, rests someone whose face is one of the most recognized brand images in the world. Colonel Harland Sanders. Yes, that Colonel Sanders, the white-suited, goateed founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken. What most people don't realize is that Sanders didn't achieve success until his 60s. He spent decades bouncing between jobs, working as a steamboat pilot, insurance salesman, gas station operator, and restaurant cook. When a new interstate highway bypassed the small restaurant he ran in Corbin, Kentucky, and killed his business, the 65-year-old Sanders hit the road. He drove from restaurant to restaurant with a pressure cooker and his secret blend of spices, trying to franchise his recipe. By the mid-1960s, he had 600 franchises and sold the company for $2 million. He stayed on as the brand's spokesman, and his image became the logo. Sanders died in 1980 at the age of 90 from pneumonia. Sanders' persistence is what makes his story so remarkable. Most people, at 65, having just lost their business, would have retired. Sanders got in his car and started driving. He was rejected over 1,000 times by his own account before a restaurant in Salt Lake City finally agreed to use his recipe. Once the franchises started multiplying, the growth was explosive. By the time he sold the company in 1964, Kentucky Fried Chicken was one of the most recognizable brands in America. Sanders stayed on as the face of the company, and his white suit and string tie became so iconic that the company eventually made his image the permanent logo. He was also famously blunt about what happened to the food quality after he sold the company, publicly calling the new gravy wallpaper paste and sludge, which didn't endear him to the corporate executives. His grave at Cave Hill Cemetery is known to Louisville locals, but it receives surprisingly few visitors for the resting place of a man whose face and fried chicken are recognized in virtually every corner of the globe. His story remains one of the great American tales of late-blooming success, proof that it's never too late to start over. From finger-licking good to literary greatness, let's drive to Oxford, Mississippi. At St. Peter's Cemetery rests William Faulkner, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist who set most of his work in the fictional Yoknapatawpha County, a stand-in for the real Mississippi he knew intimately. Faulkner wrote The Sound and the Fury, As I Lay Dying, Light in August, and Absalom, Absalom, novels that experimented with stream of consciousness and fractured timelines in ways that were genuinely revolutionary. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1949 and 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He also moonlighted as a Hollywood screenwriter, contributing to the scripts of The Big Sleep and To Have and Have Not. Faulkner was a private man who found fame uncomfortable and was a heavy drinker for most of his life. He died in 1962 at the age of 64 from a heart attack. His grave in Oxford is modest, befitting a man who wrote some of the most complex sentences in the English language about the simplest, most elemental human experiences: love, honor, pity, pride, compassion, and sacrifice. While the town celebrates its literary son in his home, Rowan Oak operates as a museum. The cemetery itself stays quiet. Faulkner's Nobel Prize acceptance speech in Stockholm in 1950 is one of the most important literary statements of the 20th century. Standing before the Swedish Academy, he declared that it was the writer's duty to help man endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. It was a declaration of faith in the human spirit at a time when the atomic bomb had given humanity reason to despair. In Oxford, Faulkner was a familiar figure, walking the town square, attending Ole Miss football games, riding horses on his property. He was a private man who found fame uncomfortable and was a heavy drinker for most of his life. Visitors have been known to leave bottles of bourbon on his grave, a nod to his well-known habits, but those visitors are few and far between. From the Deep South to New England, let's visit Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, America's first landscaped rural cemetery, founded in 1831. Here lies Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, once the most famous poet in America. Longfellow wrote Paul Revere's Ride, the Song of Hiawatha, and Evangeline, poems that were memorized by schoolchildren for generations and woven into the fabric of American identity. In the 19th century, Longfellow was a genuine celebrity, so famous that his 75th birthday was celebrated in schools across the country. He was the first American poet honored with a bust in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey in London. Today, his reputation has faded in literary circles, where his accessible musical style fell out of fashion with the rise of modernism, but his words remain deeply embedded in American culture. If you've ever heard the phrase, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere," that's Longfellow. In his own time, Longfellow was not just famous, he was beloved. When his wife Fanny died in a fire in 1861, the nation mourned with him. The grief transformed him physically. He grew the long white beard that appears in his most famous portraits because fire had scarred his face too badly to shave. Despite this devastating personal loss, he continued to write and to translate, producing a highly regarded translation of Dante's Divine Comedy. His home in Cambridge, Craigie House, which had served as George Washington's headquarters during the Siege of Boston, became a gathering place for the literary elite of New England. He died in 1882 at the age of 75, the most famous poet America had yet produced. His grave at Mount Auburn, once a pilgrimage site for readers who revered him, now sits peacefully among the ancient trees of America's most beautiful cemetery. Let's travel to a cemetery that's almost a character in American history. At Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri, rests Dred Scott, the enslaved man who sued for his freedom and whose case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1857, the court ruled against him in one of the most notorious decisions in American legal history. Chief Justice Roger Taney declared that black Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The Dred Scott decision inflamed tensions between North and South and was a key catalyst on the road to the Civil War. Scott was freed by his owners shortly after the ruling, but he died of tuberculosis just a year later in 1858, at approximately the age of 59. His grave at Calvary Cemetery was unmarked for over a century before a headstone was finally placed in 1957. The story of Dred Scott is one of the most painful chapters in American legal history. Scott and his wife Harriet argued that because they had lived for extended periods in free territories, they were legally free. The case wound through the courts for over a decade before reaching the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Taney's ruling declared that black Americans, whether free or enslaved, could never be citizens of the United States. The decision was intended to settle the slavery question once and for all. Instead, it inflamed the nation and helped make the Civil War inevitable. Abraham Lincoln cited the ruling repeatedly in his debates with Stephen Douglas. Scott himself was freed by his owners shortly after the ruling, but lived only another year before tuberculosis took him. His grave was unmarked for over a century, a final indignity for a man who had fought for more than a decade simply to be recognized as a human being with the right to determine his own fate. A headstone was finally placed in 1957. It's rarely visited, a humble monument to a man whose fight for his own freedom helped reshape the nation. From a legal case that shook the country to a song that rocked it, let's go to North Hollywood, California. At Valhalla Memorial Park lies Ritchie Valens, who, in just 8 months of recording, became the first Mexican-American rock and roll star. Born Richard Stephen Valenzuela in the San Fernando Valley, Valens was 17 years old when he had 2 massive hits: Donna, a love ballad he wrote for a high school girlfriend, and La Bamba, his rock arrangement of a traditional Mexican folk song that became the first Spanish-language recording to chart in the United States. On February 3, 1959, a date Don McLean would later immortalize as the day the music died, Valens boarded a small charter plane in Iowa alongside Buddy Holly and J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper. The plane crashed shortly after takeoff in a snowstorm, killing everyone aboard. Valens was just 17. His entire recording career had lasted 8 months, yet his influence, particularly on Latin rock, has been enormous. The tragedy of Ritchie Valens isn't just that he died so young, it's the breadth of talent that was lost. In those 8 months, he had demonstrated a range that suggested he could have gone anywhere musically. La Bamba alone was revolutionary, a declaration that rock and roll didn't belong to any single culture. Carlos Santana, Los Lobos, and countless other Latino musicians have pointed to Valens as the man who opened the door. The 1987 film La Bamba, starring Lou Diamond Phillips, introduced his story to a new generation. But in a strange twist of fate, the crash that killed Valens, Holly, and Richardson wasn't supposed to include him. Valens won his seat on the plane in a coin toss with Tommy Allsup, Holly's guitarist. A single flip of a coin. His grave at Valhalla Memorial Park gets occasional visits, especially around the anniversary of the crash. But for most of the year it sits undisturbed. A quiet marker for a life that burned so briefly and so brightly that it's hard to believe it was real. 17 years old, 8 months of music, a coin toss, and a legacy that changed the sound of American rock and roll forever. Let's jump from rock and roll to a different kind of performance. At Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills in Los Angeles lies Liberace, the flamboyant pianist who was one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world from the 1950s through the 1980s. With his candelabra-topped pianos, his fur coats, his sequined capes, and his dazzling rings, Liberace turned piano performance into pure spectacle. At the peak of his Las Vegas career, he was reportedly earning $300,000 a week. Beneath the showmanship was a classically trained musician who had been a child prodigy in Milwaukee, performing with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra as a teenager. Liberace's television show in the 1950s made him a household name, and his live performances were legendary for their excess and joy. He died in 1987 at the age of 67 from cardiac arrest related to complications of AIDS, though his representatives initially denied the cause. Liberace understood something that many performers didn't. The audience came to be dazzled, and he was determined to dazzle them. He once arrived on stage in a Rolls-Royce covered in rhinestones. His wardrobe alone was worth millions. He had a museum in Las Vegas dedicated to his costumes and pianos. Critics savaged him for decades, and his response was legendary. He reportedly told one critic, "Thank you for your review. I cried all the way to the bank." In a career spanning more than 4 decades, Liberace sold out concert halls around the world, starred in his own television series, and earned a permanent place in the Las Vegas Pantheon. His death in 1987 was one of the first high-profile celebrity deaths attributed to AIDS, and it brought unwelcome scrutiny to the private life of a man who had spent decades carefully deflecting questions about his personal relationships. His grave at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills is in a cemetery with many famous residents, but Liberace's resting place doesn't draw the crowds his concerts once did. The candelabras have gone dark, but the showmanship lives on in every performer who understood that sometimes the audience just wants to be dazzled, and there's nothing wrong with that. Let's leave the entertainment world and visit a president whose accomplishments far outstripped his fame. In Abilene, Kansas, at the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum, rests the 34th President of the United States. Eisenhower was the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II, the man who planned and oversaw the D-Day invasion of Normandy, and then served 2 terms as president. Under his administration, the interstate highway system was built, NASA was created, the Korean War was ended, and the American economy boomed. In his farewell address, he warned the nation about the growing influence of the military-industrial complex, a warning that still resonates. Eisenhower died in 1969 at the age of 78 from congestive heart failure. He's buried in a simple GI-style grave on the grounds of the Presidential Center in Abilene, the small Kansas town where he grew up. What makes Eisenhower's relative obscurity so striking is the scope of what he accomplished. As Supreme Commander, he held together an alliance of enormous egos, including Churchill, de Gaulle, Montgomery, and Patton, and directed the most complex military operation in human history. The decision to launch the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, with the weather uncertain and the stakes incalculable, was his alone. He had drafted a statement taking full blame in case the invasion failed. It didn't. As president, he governed with a steady hand during some of the tensest years of the Cold War, resisting pressure to use nuclear weapons in Korea, and managing crises from Suez to Sputnik. The interstate highway system, which he championed and signed into law, transformed American life more than almost any single piece of legislation in the 20th century. He chose to be buried in a simple GI-style grave on the grounds of the Presidential Center in Abilene, the small Kansas town where he grew up. While the library and museum receive some visitors, Abilene is in the middle of Kansas, far from any major city. For a 5-star general who helped save the free world and then led it for 8 years, his resting place is remarkably quiet. The simplicity of that GI-style grave, identical to those of ordinary soldiers, says something important about Eisenhower. He could have had a grand monument. He chose to be buried as a soldier among soldiers. From one president to another. Let's head east to Princeton, New Jersey, where at Princeton Cemetery lies Grover Cleveland, the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, the 22nd and 24th. Cleveland was a president of stubborn integrity in an age of corruption, a Democrat who won the popular vote 3 times in a row in 1884, 1888, and 1892, though he lost the Electoral College in the middle race. He was known for his honesty, his vetoes. He vetoed more bills than all previous presidents combined, and for a remarkable secret. In 1893, a cancerous growth was removed from his jaw during surgery performed aboard a yacht on the East River, all hidden from the press and the public. The secret wasn't revealed until 1917. Cleveland retired to Princeton and died in 1908 at the age of 71 from heart failure. Cleveland was also the president who dedicated the Statue of Liberty, who reformed the civil service, and who tried to lower tariffs in an era when the Republican Party used them as a fundraising tool. He was not a glamorous president, but he was an honest one, and in the Gilded Age, that counted for something. His secret jaw surgery in 1893, performed on a friend's yacht to avoid public panic during an economic depression, was one of the most remarkable cover-ups in presidential history. A rubber prosthesis replaced part of his upper jaw, and the secret held for over 2 decades. Cleveland retired to Princeton, befriended the university's president, Woodrow Wilson, and died in 1908 at the age of 71. His last words were reportedly, "I have tried so hard to do right." His grave sits in a university town full of tourists and scholars, but none of them come looking for Grover Cleveland. Let's head to a very different part of New York. At St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx rests Billie Holiday, the woman whose voice defined an era of American music. Lady Day, the voice that made Strange Fruit a devastating protest against lynching. The voice behind God Bless the Child, Lover Man, and Good Morning Heartache. Holiday didn't have the range of Ella Fitzgerald or the power of Bessie Smith, but she had something neither possessed: a way of wringing every drop of emotion from a lyric that made you feel she was singing directly to you. She could transform a simple pop tune into a shattering emotional experience. Born Eleanora Fagan in Philadelphia, she survived a childhood of poverty and abuse. She began singing in Harlem nightclubs as a teenager and was discovered by producer John Hammond. By the late 1930s, she was a star. But the same sensitivity that made her singing extraordinary also made her vulnerable. She battled heroin addiction for most of her adult life, lost her New York cabaret card, which devastated her ability to perform, and was in and out of legal trouble. Holiday died in 1959 at the age of 44 from cirrhosis of the liver. She reportedly had just 70 cents in the bank. Strange Fruit, the song that became her signature protest piece, was so powerful and so disturbing in its imagery of black bodies hanging from trees that some nightclub owners refused to let her sing it. She sang it anyway, always as the final number of her set, with the room darkened and a single spotlight on her face. It remains one of the most important recordings in American music history. Time magazine named it the Song of the Century. Holiday's influence on every vocalist who followed her, from Frank Sinatra to Amy Winehouse, is immeasurable. Sinatra himself said she was the greatest single musical influence on him. Her grave at St. Raymond's is in a large, sprawling cemetery in the Bronx, and it sees only occasional visitors, which seems wrong for a voice that still stops people in their tracks 70 years after it was silenced. From Lady Day to the Lady of the Wild West, let's travel all the way to Deadwood, South Dakota. At Mount Moriah Cemetery, perched on a hillside overlooking the old frontier town, lies Calamity Jane. Born Martha Jane Canary, she was a frontierswoman, sharpshooter, and storyteller who became a legend of the American West, although separating fact from her own considerable exaggerations is nearly impossible. She claimed to have scouted for General Custer and ridden for the Pony Express. But what is documented is that she was a hard-living woman who could ride, shoot, and drink in an era when women were expected to do none of those things. She was also known for acts of genuine kindness, reportedly nursing sick miners during a smallpox epidemic in Deadwood. Calamity Jane died in 1903 at the age of 51. By her request, she was buried next to Wild Bill Hickok, the legendary gunslinger she claimed was the love of her life, a claim Hickok's family strongly disputed. The real Calamity Jane is hard to pin down because she told such extravagant stories about herself. But what's clear is that she was a woman completely out of step with the expectations of her time, and she didn't care. She wore men's clothing, drank heavily, worked as a teamster and a scout, and moved through the frontier towns of the West with a freedom that scandalized polite society. In her later years, she joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and toured briefly as a celebrity, though alcoholism had taken its toll. She died poor and largely alone in a hotel room in Terry, South Dakota. The people of Deadwood brought her body back and buried her next to Hickok on the hillside cemetery overlooking the gulch. Mount Moriah is a modest tourist stop in a small, remote town that mostly draws summer visitors. For most of the year, Calamity Jane rests in the quiet company of the Black Hills, which is probably how she would have wanted it. She was never one for crowds unless she was causing a commotion in them. From the Old West to old money, let's travel to Sleepy Hollow, New York, and its famous cemetery. Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is known for its connection to Washington Irving's legend of the Headless Horseman, but among its residents is someone whose impact on the real world dwarfs any ghost story: Andrew Carnegie. The Scottish-born industrialist who built the American steel industry and then gave away most of his fortune is buried here among the rolling hills and old oaks. Carnegie was once the richest man in the world. After selling his steel empire to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for nearly $500 million, an astronomical sum at the time, he spent the remaining 18 years of his life distributing his wealth. He funded the construction of over 2,500 public libraries across the English-speaking world. He established Carnegie Hall, created the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and built what became Carnegie Mellon University. He believed the wealthy had a moral obligation to give away their fortunes during their lifetimes. Carnegie died in 1919 at the age of 83. Carnegie's story is one of the most remarkable rags-to-riches tales in American history. He arrived in the United States as a 13-year-old Scottish immigrant, worked in a cotton mill for $1.20 a week, and through a combination of intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness built the largest steel company in the world. His mills produced the steel that built America's bridges, railroads, and skyscrapers. But it's what he did after selling the company that defines his legacy. He gave away roughly $350 million, the equivalent of billions today, during the last 18 years of his life. He believed that the man who dies rich dies disgraced, and he lived by it. His philanthropic philosophy, which he outlined in his essay The Gospel of Wealth, influenced generations of wealthy Americans, from the Rockefellers to Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. Carnegie died in 1919 at the age of 83 at his estate in the Berkshires. His grave in Sleepy Hollow is Celtic in style, a nod to his Scottish roots, and while the cemetery draws visitors curious about the Headless Horseman legend, Carnegie's grave itself is rarely sought out, a footnote in a town better known for a ghost story than for the resting place of a man who gave away more money than almost anyone in history. Let's head back to the world of comedy and travel to Westfield, New Jersey. At Fairview Cemetery rests Charles Addams, the cartoonist who created the Addams Family. For over 50 years, Addams drew his macabre, darkly humorous cartoons for The New Yorker, creating a family of cheerfully ghoulish characters: Gomez, Morticia, Uncle Fester, Lurch, Wednesday, and Pugsley. They delighted in everything morbid and found normal suburban life utterly baffling. The characters inspired a television series in the 1960s, 2 hit films in the 1990s, and a recent Netflix series starring Jenna Ortega. Addams himself was a charming, witty man who bore little resemblance to his creations. He died in 1988 at the age of 76 from a heart attack. He was reportedly found slumped over his steering wheel in his car outside his home. His grave in Westfield is in the same town where he grew up, the place that reportedly served as visual inspiration for the Addams family's neighborhood, with its Victorian houses and slightly gloomy atmosphere. Addams's cartoons tapped into something deeper than simple ghoulishness. The Addams family was, in its way, the happiest family in America. Gomez and Morticia were deeply in love. The children were encouraged to explore their interests, however unusual. The family was wealthy, generous, and warmly welcoming to strangers, even as those strangers recoiled in horror. The joke wasn't that the Addamses were freaks. The joke was that they were more functional and more loving than the normal families who surrounded them. That subversive warmth is what made them endure across decades and adaptations. Addams drew for The New Yorker from 1938 until his death 50 years later, producing some of the most recognizable cartoons in the magazine's history. Almost nobody visits his grave, which is ironic for a man whose greatest creations celebrated death with such gleeful enthusiasm. Let's travel west to one of the most unusual towns in America. Colma, California, just south of San Francisco, has more dead residents than living ones. San Francisco banned new burials within city limits in 1900, and most of its cemeteries were eventually relocated to Colma. At Hills of Eternity Memorial Park in Colma lies Wyatt Earp, the legendary lawman of the Old West, the man who stood at the OK Corral. In popular culture, Earp has been played by everyone from Burt Lancaster to Kevin Costner to Kurt Russell. But the real Wyatt Earp was more complicated than any movie version. He was a lawman, a gambler, a saloon keeper, and a man who spent decades trying to escape the shadow of the 30-second gunfight that made him famous. After the events in Tombstone, Arizona, Earp drifted through the West before settling in Los Angeles, where he befriended early Hollywood cowboys like Tom Mix. He died in 1929 at the age of 80. His wife Josephine had him buried in the Hills of Eternity, a Jewish cemetery, according to her family's traditions. Earp's decades after Tombstone are as fascinating as the gunfight itself. He bounced from Alaska during the gold rush to refereeing a controversial boxing match in San Francisco to mining claims in the Mojave Desert. In Los Angeles, he fell in with the early movie cowboys and reportedly consulted on Western films, helping to shape the myths that would later be told about him. He died in 1929, and the pallbearers at his funeral included Tom Mix, the biggest cowboy star in Hollywood. His third wife, Josephine Marcus Earp, spent the rest of her life fiercely protecting his reputation, threatening lawsuits against anyone who portrayed him unfavorably. She had him buried at Hills of Eternity, a Jewish cemetery in Colma, according to her family's traditions. The grave is far from Tombstone, far from the tourists, and far from the legend, which is probably exactly how Josie wanted it. From a lawman to the most notorious gangster in American history, at Mount Carmel Cemetery on the south side of Chicago lies Al Capone, the man who ruled Chicago's underworld during Prohibition. Scarface controlled a vast empire of bootlegging, gambling, and vice, earning an estimated $60 million a year in 1920s money. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, in which 7 members of a rival gang were gunned down, cemented his reputation as the most dangerous man in America. It took the federal government to bring him down, not for murder, but for tax evasion. He served about 7 years in prison, including time at Alcatraz, before being released in 1939 with his mind ravaged by untreated syphilis. He spent his final years at his Florida estate, mentally diminished, and died of cardiac arrest following a stroke in 1947 at the age of 48. His grave at Mount Carmel sits among the headstones of a suburban Chicago cemetery, and while it once attracted curiosity seekers, today it's largely forgotten. Which is perhaps fitting. Capone was once the most feared man in America, a figure whose name alone could silence a room. But his final years tell a different story. After his release from Alcatraz, where he had spent time in solitary confinement and suffered the progressive neurological destruction of untreated syphilis, Capone was a shadow of his former self. At his Florida estate, he wandered the grounds in a bathrobe, fished off the dock, and had conversations with people who weren't there. The most dangerous gangster in American history died babbling like a child. His family buried him quietly, and the city that once trembled at his name moved on. From poetry to the Wild West one more time. At Corona del Mar, in Pacific View Memorial Park, lies John Wayne, and this is a grave with an unusual story. When Wayne died, his family buried him in an unmarked grave to prevent vandalism and overcrowding. For 19 years, fans who tracked down the location found only grass. In 1998, a small bronze plaque was finally placed at the site. Wayne, born Marian Robert Morrison, was the biggest movie star in the world for the better part of 3 decades. He embodied the American cowboy, the American soldier, the American tough guy. Stagecoach made him a star in 1939. The Searchers is widely considered his greatest performance. True Grit won him his only Academy Award, playing the one-eyed Marshal Rooster Cogburn. He appeared in over 170 films. Wayne died of stomach cancer in 1979 at the age of 72. Wayne's influence extended far beyond the movies. He became a symbol of a certain kind of American masculinity, the strong, silent type who did what needed doing without complaining about it. Politicians quoted him. Soldiers idolized him. He received the Congressional Gold Medal, and the airport in Orange County, California, was renamed John Wayne Airport in his honor. His final film, The Shootist in 1976, cast him as an aging gunfighter dying of cancer, mirroring his own battle with the disease. It was a fitting farewell for a man who had always played characters who faced death on their own terms. Even with the plaque now in place, his grave at Pacific View sees only a handful of visitors on most days, a stark contrast to a man who topped polls as the most popular movie star in America for decades. Let's return to Westwood Memorial Park, where we started our tour, for one more visit. Here rests Rodney Dangerfield, the king of the one-liner, the master of self-deprecation, the man who got no respect. Dangerfield didn't achieve stardom until he was in his 40s, after decades of struggling in comedy clubs and briefly quitting show business entirely to sell aluminum siding in New Jersey. When he finally broke through with appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show and then The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, his rapid-fire delivery and trademark tie-tugging made him unforgettable. He starred in Caddyshack, Back to School, and Easy Money, and his comedy albums were bestsellers. He also opened a comedy club called Dangerfields in New York, where he helped launch the careers of comedians including Jim Carrey, Jerry Seinfeld, and Roseanne Barr. Dangerfield died in 2004 at the age of 82 from complications following heart valve surgery. He's buried here at Westwood, the same little cemetery where we began. What most people don't know about Dangerfield is the depth of his suffering before he made it. He started in comedy in his 20s under the name Jack Roy, couldn't make a living at it, and quit the business entirely. For over a decade, he sold aluminum siding in New Jersey, married, had children, and lived a completely ordinary life. Then, in his early 40s, he went back. He changed his name to Rodney Dangerfield, developed the No Respect character, and started climbing. The breakthrough came slowly, one Tonight Show appearance at a time, until he was one of the most beloved comedians in America. He was well into his 50s before he became a movie star with Caddyshack. His comedy club in Manhattan became the premier showcase room in New York, and his willingness to champion young comics earned him the gratitude of an entire generation of stand-ups. Even in death, as he might have put it, he gets no respect. His grave sits largely unvisited here at Westwood, just steps from some of the biggest names in Hollywood. The man who spent decades selling aluminum siding before becoming one of the funniest people alive would probably shrug and adjust his tie. Heading out to the heartland, let's head to a place few tourists ever think to visit. In Waukesha, Wisconsin, at Prairie Home Cemetery, rests Les Paul, a man who shaped the sound of modern music more than almost anyone in the 20th century. If you play guitar, you know the name. The Gibson Les Paul is one of the most iconic electric guitars ever made, designed by and named for this man. But Les Paul didn't just lend his name to a guitar. He was a genuine innovator who pioneered multi-track recording, overdubbing, and sound-on-sound techniques that made modern popular music possible. Without his innovations, the records of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and virtually every rock and pop act that followed would have sounded completely different. He was also a gifted performer who continued playing live well into his 90s, holding a weekly residency at the Iridium Jazz Club in New York City. Les Paul died in 2009 at the age of 94 from pneumonia. Les Paul's impact on music is so fundamental that it's almost invisible, like asking a fish to notice water. Every time you hear a rock record with layered guitars, that's Les Paul. Every time a singer's voice is doubled or harmonized in the studio, that's his multi-track technique. He and his wife, the singer Mary Ford, had a string of hits in the early 1950s that showcased his recording innovations, and their sound was unlike anything anyone had heard before. Paul was also a tireless tinkerer who kept working well into his 90s. Even after arthritis gnarled his fingers, he found ways to keep playing, performing Monday nights at the Iridium Jazz Club in Manhattan until just months before his death. Musicians from every genre made pilgrimages to those Monday night shows, sitting in awe of the 90-something-year-old man who had essentially built the toolkit they all used. His grave in the small Wisconsin city where he grew up is far from any spotlight, and while guitarists and audio engineers revere his name, almost nobody thinks to visit. It's one of the great oversights in American cultural memory. And now, for our final stop. Let's head back to New York City, to the place where American ambition and American sorrow so often converge. At Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx rests a giant whose grave deserves our attention. Joseph Pulitzer lies here, the newspaper publisher whose name you know from the most prestigious prize in American journalism. Pulitzer was a Hungarian immigrant who arrived in America in 1864, fought in the Civil War as a teenager, and worked his way into the newspaper business in St. Louis before purchasing the New York World and turning it into one of the most influential papers in the country. He was a fierce advocate for progressive causes and used his front page to battle corruption, though critics accused him of sensationalism and what they called yellow journalism. Before his death, Pulitzer endowed Columbia University's School of Journalism and established the Pulitzer Prizes, which have been awarded annually since 1917 and remain the gold standard of achievement in journalism, literature, and music composition. Pulitzer died in 1911 at the age of 64, aboard his yacht in Charleston Harbor. His monument at Woodlawn is substantial, but in a cemetery of more than 300,000 burials, spanning 400 acres, it doesn't stand out the way you might expect. Pulitzer's life was as dramatic as anything his newspapers reported. He arrived in America speaking almost no English, enlisted as a substitute soldier in the Civil War, and nearly starved before finding work at a German-language newspaper in St. Louis. His competitive war with William Randolph Hearst in New York in the 1890s helped trigger the Spanish-American War and gave birth to the term yellow journalism. But Pulitzer also championed investigative reporting that exposed corruption and gave voice to immigrants and working people. His endowment of the Pulitzer Prizes created a standard of excellence that has guided American journalism, literature, and music for more than a century. Every year, journalists and writers across the country dream of winning the prize that bears his name, but almost none of them visit the man who created it. And with that, friends, our tour comes to an end. 50 graves, 50 lives, presidents and poets, boxers and band leaders, inventors and icons. We've traveled from coast to coast, from the rolling hills of Kentucky to the cemeteries of the Bronx, from the Black Hills of South Dakota to the quiet suburbs of New Jersey. All of these people were famous once, some of them famous still, but all of them resting in places where the footsteps have grown fewer and the flowers a little less fresh. That's not a verdict on their legacy. It's just the way time works. Fame is a strange thing. It burns so bright while it lasts, but the world moves fast, and new names replace old ones, and the places where the great ones rest grow quiet. But the music plays on. The movies still flicker. The inventions still hum. The books are still read. The jokes still land, and the stories are still worth telling. So the next time you're near one of these cemeteries, consider stopping in. You don't need to bring flowers. You don't need to say anything. Just stand there for a moment and remember that someone who made the world a little richer, a little funnier, a little more beautiful, is resting right beneath your feet. The least we can do is remember. So remember them. And thanks for walking with us.